The Story of Civilization, Volume 2, The Life of Greece, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 6, Side 1. A generation later, in the age of Pericles, Acragas raised more modest structures. One of them, the Temple of Concord, survives almost completely, and of the Temple of Hera there remains an impressive colonnade, enough in either case to show that Greek taste was not confined to Athens, and that even the commercial West had learned that size is not development. In Acragas the great Empedocles would be born, and perhaps it was there, and not in Aetna's crater, that he would die. Syracuse began as it is today, a village huddled on the promontory of Ortygia. As far back as the 8th century, Corinth had sent colonists, armed with righteousness and superior weapons, to seize the little peninsula, which was then perhaps an island. They built or widened the connection with the mainland of Sicily, and drove most of the Sicels into the interior. They multiplied with all the rapidity of a vigorous people on a resourceful soil. In time, their city became the largest in Greece, with a circumference of 14 miles and a population of 500,000 souls. An aristocracy of landholders was overthrown about 495 by a revolt of the unfranchised plebes in alliance with the enslaved Sicels. The new democracy, if we may believe Aristotle, proved incapable of establishing an orderly society, and in 485 Gelon of Gela, by a program of enlightened treachery, set up a dictatorship. Like many of his kind, he was as able as he was unscrupulous. Scorning all moral codes and political restraints, he transformed Ortygia into an impregnable fortress for his government, conquered Naxos, Leontini, and Messana, and taxed all eastern Sicily to make Syracuse the most beautiful of Greek capitals. In this way, says Herodotus sadly, Gelon became a great king. Gelon of Syracuse, says Lucian, had disagreeable breath, but did not find it out himself for a long time, no one venturing to mention such a circumstance to a tyrant. At last a foreign woman who had a connection with him dared to tell him, whereupon he went to his wife and scolded her for never having, with all her opportunities of knowing, warned him of it. She put in the defense that, as she had never been familiar or at close quarters with any other man, she had supposed all men were like that. He was disarmed. He redeemed himself and became the idolized Napoleon of Sicily when, as Xerxes's fleet moved upon Athens, the Carthaginians sent an armada only less numerous than the Persian to wrest the island paradise from the Greeks. The fate of Sicily was joined with that of Greece when in the same month, tradition said on the same day, Gelon faced Hamilcar at Himera, and Themistocles confronted Xerxes at Salamis. 6. The Greeks in Africa. The Carthaginians had reason to be disturbed, for even on the north coast of Africa the Greeks had established cities and were capturing trade. As early as 630, the Dorians of Thera had sent a numerous colony to Cyrene, midway between Carthage and Egypt. There, on the desert's edge, they found good soil, with rain so abundant that the natives spoke of the site as the place where there was a hole in the sky. The Greeks used part of the land for pasturage, and exported wool and hides. They grew from the silphium plant a spice that all Greece was eager to buy. They sold Greek products to Africa, and developed their own handicrafts to such a point that Cyrenaic vases ranked among the best. The city used its wealth intelligently, and adorned itself with great gardens, temples, statuary, and gymnasiums. Here the first famous Epicurean philosopher, Aristippus, was born, and here, after much wandering, he returned to found the Cyrenaic school. Within Egypt itself, normally hostile to any foreign settlement, the Greeks gained a foothold, at last an empire. About 650, the Milesians opened a factory or trading post at Naucratis, on the Canopic branch of the Nile. Pharaoh Psamtik I tolerated them because they made good mercenaries, while their commerce provided rich prey for his collectors of customs revenues. Ahmose II gave them a large measure of self-government. Naucratis became almost an industrial city, with manufactures of pottery, terracotta, and faience. Still more, it became an emporium of trade, bringing in Greek oil and wine and sending out Egyptian wheat, linen and wool, African ivory, frankincense, and gold. Gradually, amid these exchanges, Egyptian lore and techniques in religion, architecture, sculpture, and science flowed into Greece, while in return Greek words and ways entered Egypt and paved the way for Greek domination in the Alexandrian age. If in imagination we take a merchant vessel from Naucratis to Athens, our tour of the Greek world will be complete. It was necessary that we should make this long circuit, in order that we might see and feel the extent and variety of Hellenic civilization. Aristotle described the constitutional history of 158 Greek city-states, but there were 1,000 more. Each contributed in commerce, industry, and thought to what we mean by Greece. In the colonies, rather than on the mainland, were born Greek poetry and prose, mathematics and metaphysics, oratory and history. Without them, and the 1,000 absorbing tentacles which they stretched out into the Old World, Greek civilization, the most precious product in history, might never have been. Through them, the cultures of Egypt and the Orient passed into Greece, and Greek culture spread slowly into Asia, Africa, and Europe. Chapter 8. The Gods of Greece. 1. The Sources of Polytheism. When we look for unifying elements in the civilization of these scattered cities, we find essentially 5. A common language, with local dialects, a common intellectual life in which only major figures in literature, philosophy, and science are known far beyond their political frontiers, a common passion for athletics, finding outlet in municipal and interstate games, a love of beauty locally expressed in forms of art common to all the Greek communities, and a partly common religious ritual and belief. Religion divided the cities as much as it united them. Under the polite and general worship of the remote Olympians lay the intenser cults of local deities and powers who served no vassalage to Zeus. Tribal and political separatism nourished polytheism and made monotheism impossible. In the early days, every family had its own god. To him the divine fire burned unextinguished at the hearth, and to him offerings of food and wine were made before every meal. This holy communion, or sharing of food with the god, was the basic and primary act of religion in the home. Birth, marriage, and death were sanctified into sacraments by ancient ritual before the sacred fire, and in this way religion suffused a mystic poetry and a stabilizing solemnity over the elemental events of human life. In like manner, the gene, the phratry, the tribe, and the city each had its special god. Athens worshipped Athena, Eleusis Demeter, Samos Hera, Ephesus Artemis, Poseidonia Poseidon. The center and summit of the city was the shrine of the city god. Participation in the worship of the god was the sign, the privilege, and the requisite of citizenship. When the city marched out to war, it carried the form and emblem of its god in the forefront of the troops, and no important step was taken without consulting him through divination. In return, he fought for the city, and sometimes seemed to appear at the head or above the spears of the soldiers. Victory was the conquest not only of a city by a city, but of a god by a god. The city, like the family or the tribe, kept always burning, at a public altar in the Prytaneum or town hall, a sacred fire symbolizing the mystically potent and persistent life of the city's founders and heroes. And periodically the citizens partook of a common meal before this fire. Just as in the family the father was also the priest, so in the Greek city the chief magistrate or archon was the high priest of the state religion, and all his powers and actions were sanctified by the god. By this conscription of the supernatural, man was tamed from a hunter into a citizen. Liberated by local independence, the religious imagination of Greece produced a luxuriant mythology and a populous pantheon. Every object or force of earth or sky, every blessing and every terror, every quality, even the vices of mankind, was personified as a deity, usually in human form. No other religion has ever been so anthropomorphic as the Greek. Every craft, profession, and art had its divinity, or as we should say, its patron saint. In addition, there were demons, harpies, furies, fairies, gorgons, sirens, nymphs, almost as numerous as the mortals of the earth. The old question, is religion created by priests, is here settled. It is incredible that any conspiracy of primitive theologians should have begotten such a plethora of gods. It must have been a boon to have so many deities, so many fascinating legends, sacred shrines, and solemn or joyous festivals. Polytheism is as natural as polygamy, and survives as long, suiting well all the contradictory currents of the world. Even today, in Mediterranean Christianity, it is not God who is worshipped so much as the saints. It is polytheism that sheds over the simple life the inspiring poetry of consolatory myth, and gives to the humble soul the aid and comfort that it would not venture to expect from a supreme being unapproachably awful and remote. Each of the gods had a mythos, or story, attached to him, which accounted for his place in the city's life, or for the ritual that honored him. These myths, rising spontaneously out of the lore of the place and the people, or out of the inventions and embellishments of rhapsodists, became at once the faith and the philosophy, the literature and the history of the early Greek. From them came the subjects that adorned Greek vases and suggested to artists countless paintings, statues, and reliefs. Despite the achievements of philosophy and the attempts of a few to preach a monotheistic creed, the people continued to the end of Hellenic civilization to create myths and even gods. Men like Heraclitus might allegorize the myths, or like Plato adapt them, or like Xenophanes denounce them. But when Pausanias toured Greece 5 centuries after Plato, he found still alive among the people the legends that had warmed the heart of the Homeric age. The mythopoetic, theopoetic process is natural, and goes on today as always. There is a birth rate as well as a death rate of the gods. Deity is like energy, and its quantity remains, through all the vicissitudes of form, approximately unchanged from generation to generation. 2. An inventory of the gods. 1. The lesser deities. We shall force some order and clarity upon this swarm of gods if we artificially divide them into 7 groups: sky gods, earth gods, fertility gods, animal gods, subterranean gods, ancestor or hero gods, and Olympians. The names of all of them, as Hesiod said, it were troublesome for a mortal man to tell. 1. Originally, so far as we can make out, the great god of the invading Greeks, as of the Vedic Hindus, was the noble and various sky itself. It was probably this sky god who, with progressing anthropomorphism, became Uranus, or heaven, and then the cloud-compelling, rain-making, thunder-herding Zeus. In a land surfeited with sunshine and hungry for rain, the sun, Helios, was only a minor deity. Agamemnon prayed to him, and the Spartans sacrificed horses to him to draw his flaming chariot through the skies. The Rhodians, in Hellenistic days, honored Helios as their chief divinity, flung annually into the sea 4 horses and a chariot for his use, and dedicated to him the famous Colossus. And Anaxagoras almost lost his life, even in Periclean Athens, for saying that the sun was not a god, but only a ball of fire. Generally, however, there was little worship of the sun in classic Greece, still less of the moon, Selene, least of all of the planets or the stars. 2. The earth, not the heavens, was the home of most Greek gods. And first the earth itself was the goddess Ge, or Gaea, patient and bountiful mother, pregnant through the embrace of reigning Uranus, the sky. 1,000 lesser deities dwelt on the earth, in its waters or in its surrounding air. Spirits of sacred trees, especially the oak, Nereids, Naiads, Oceanids, in rivers, lakes, or the sea, gods gushing forth as wells or springs, or flowing as stately streams, like the Meander or the Spercheius, gods of the wind, like Boreas, Zephyr, Notus, and Eurus, with their master, Aeolus, or the great god Pan, the horned, cloven-footed, sensual, smiling nourisher, god of shepherds and flocks, of woods and the wild life lurking in them, he whose magic flute could be heard in every brook and dell, whose startling cry brought panic to any careless herd, and whose attendants were merry fauns and satyrs, and those old satyrs called Sileni, half goat and half Socrates. Everywhere in nature there were gods. The air was so crowded with spirits of good or evil that, said an unknown poet, there is not one empty chink into which you could push the spike of a blade of corn. 3. The most mysterious and potent force in nature being reproduction, it was natural that the Greeks, like other ancient peoples, should worship the principle and emblems of fertility in man and woman, along with their worship of fertility in the soil. The phallus, as symbol of reproduction, appears in the rites of Demeter, Dionysius, Hermes, and even of the chaste Artemis. In classical sculpture and painting, this emblem recurs with scandalous frequency. Even the great Dionysia, the religious festival at which the Greek drama was played, was introduced by phallic processions to which Athenian colonies piously sent phalli. Doubtless, such festivals lent themselves to much lusty humor, as one may judge from Aristophanes. But all in all, the humor was healthy and perhaps served the purpose of stimulating eros and promoting the birth rate. The more vulgar side of this fertility cult was expressed in the Hellenistic and Roman periods by the worship of Priapus, born of an amour between Dionysus and Aphrodite, and popular with vase painters and the mural artists of Pompeii. A lovelier variation of the reproductive theme was the veneration of goddesses representing motherhood. Arcadia, Argos, Eleusis, Athens, Ephesus, and other localities gave their greatest devotion to feminine deities, often husbandless. Such goddesses presumably reflect a primitive matrilinear age before the coming of marriage. The enthronement of Zeus as father god over all gods represents the victory of the patriarchal principle. The probable priority of women in agriculture may have helped to give form to the greatest of these mother deities, Demeter, goddess of the corn or the tilled earth. One of the most beautiful of Greek myths, skillfully narrated in the hymn to Demeter once attributed to Homer, tells how Demeter's daughter Persephone, while gathering flowers, was kidnapped by Pluto, god of the underworld, and snatched down to Hades. The sorrowing mother searched for her everywhere, found her, and persuaded Pluto to let Persephone live on the earth 9 months in every year, a pretty symbol for the annual death and rebirth of the soil. Because the people of Eleusis befriended the disguised Demeter as she sat by the way, grieved in her inmost heart, she taught them and Attica the secret of agriculture, and sent Triptolemus, son of Eleusis' king, to spread the art among mankind. Essentially, it was the same myth as that of Isis and Osiris in Egypt, Tammuz and Ishtar in Babylonia, Astarte and Adonis in Syria, Cybele and Attis in Phrygia. The cult of motherhood survived through classical times to take new life in the worship of Mary, the Mother of God. 4. Certain animals in early Greece were honored as semi-deities. Greek religion was too anthropomorphic in its sculptural age to admit the divine menageries that we find in Egypt and India, but a vestige of a less classical past appears in the frequent association of an animal with a god. The bull was sacred because of its strength and potency. It was often an associate, disguise, or symbol of Zeus and Dionysius, and perhaps preceded them as a god. In like manner, the cow-eyed Hera may once have been a sacred cow. The pig, too, was holy because of its fertility. It was associated with the gentle Demeter. At one of her festivals, the Thesmophoria, the sacrifice was ostensibly of a pig, and possibly to it. At the feast of the Diasia, the sacrifice was nominally to Zeus, really to a subterranean snake that was now dignified with his name. Whether the snake was holy as supposedly deathless, or as a symbol of reproductive power, we find it passing down as a deity from the snake goddess of Crete into 5th century Athens. In the temple of Athena, on the Acropolis, a sacred serpent dwelt, to whom each month a honey cake was offered in appeasing sacrifice. In Greek art, a snake is often seen about the figures of Hermes, Apollo, and Asclepius. Under the shield of Phidias's Athene Parthenos was wreathed a mighty serpent. The Farnese Athena is half covered with snakes. The snake was often used as a symbol or form of the guardian deity of temple or home. Perhaps because it prowled about tombs, it was believed to be the soul of the dead. The Pythian games are thought to have been celebrated at first in honor of the dead Python of Delphi. 5. The most terrible of the gods were under the earth. In caves and clefts and like nether chambers dwelt those Chthonian or earthly deities whom the Greeks worshipped not by day with loving adoration, but at night with apotropaic rites of riddance and fear. These vague non-human powers were the real autochthonoi of Greece, older than the Hellenes, perhaps older than the Mycenaeans, who probably transmitted them to Greece. If we could trace them to their origin, we might find that they were the vengeful spirits of the animals that had been driven into the forests or under the soil by the advance and multiplication of men. The greatest of these subterranean deities was called Zeus Chthonius, but Zeus here meant merely God. Or he was called Zeus Mylikios, the benevolent god. But here again the words were deceptive and propitiatory, for this god was a fearful snake. Brother to Zeus was Hades, lord of the underworld that took his name. To placate him, the Greeks called him Pluto, the giver of abundance, for he had it in his power to bless or blight the roots of all things that grew in the soil. Still more ghostly and terrible was Hecate, an evil spirit that came up from the lower world and brought misfortune through her evil eye to all whom she visited. The less learned Greeks sacrificed puppies to keep her away. 6. Before the classical age, the dead were regarded as spirits capable of good and evil to men, and were appeased with offerings and prayer. They were not quite gods, but the primitive Greek family, like the Chinese, honored its dead beyond any deity. In classical Greece, these vague ghosts were more dreaded than loved, and were propitiated with aversion rituals, as in the festival of Anthesteria. The worship of heroes was an extension of the cult of the dead. Great, noble, or beautiful men or women could be raised by the gods to immortal life and become minor deities. So the people of Olympia offered annual sacrifice to Hippodamia. Cassandra was worshipped at Laconian Leuctra. Helen at Sparta, Oedipus at Colonus. Or a god might descend into the body of a mortal and transform him with divinity. Or the god might cohabit with a mortal and beget a hero god, as Zeus with Alcmena begot Heracles. Many cities, groups, even professions traced their origin to some god-born hero. So the physicians of Greece looked back to Asclepius. The god was once a dead man, ancestor, or hero. The temple was originally a tomb. The church is still in most lands a shelter for relics of the sacred dead. In general, the Greeks made less distinction between men and gods than we do. Many of their gods were as human, except in birth, as our saints, and as close to their worshippers. And though they were called immortals, some of them, like Dionysius, could die. 2. The Olympians. All these were the less famous, though not necessarily the less honored gods of Greece. How is it that we hear so little of them in Homer and so much of the Olympians? Probably because the gods of Olympus entered with the Achaeans and Dorians, overlaid the Mycenaean and Chthonian deities, and conquered them as their worshippers were conquered. We see the change in action at Dodona and Delphi, where the older god of the earth, Gaea, was displaced in the one case by Zeus, in the other by Apollo. The defeated gods were not wiped out. They remained, so to speak, as subject deities, hiding bitterly underground, but still revered by the common people, while the victorious Olympians received on their mountaintop the worship of the aristocracy. Hence Homer, who composed for the elite, says almost nothing of the nether gods. Homer, Hesiod, and the sculptors helped the political ascendancy of the conquerors to spread the cult of the Olympians. Sometimes the minor gods were combined or absorbed into the greater figures, or became their attendants or satellites, very much as minor states were now and then attached or subjected to greater ones. So the satyrs and Silene were given to Dionysius, the sea nymphs to Poseidon, the mountain and forest sprites to Artemis. The more savage rites and myths faded out. The chaos of a demon-haunted earth yielded to a semi-orderly divine government that reflected the growing political stability of the Greek world. At the head of this new regime was the majestic and patriarchal Zeus. He was not first in time. Uranus and Cronus, as we have seen, preceded him, but they and the Titans, like Lucifer's hosts, were overthrown. Zeus and his brothers cast lots to divide the world amongst them. Zeus won the sky, Poseidon the sea, Hades the bowels of the earth. There is no creation in this mythology. The world existed before the gods, and the gods do not make man out of the slime, but beget him by union among themselves or with their mortal offspring. God is literally the Father in the theology of the Greeks. Nor are the Olympians omnipotent or omniscient. Each limits the other, or even opposes the other. Any one of them, especially Zeus, can be deceived. Nevertheless, they acknowledge his suzerainty and crowd his court like the retainers of a feudal lord. And though he consults them on occasion and now and then yields his preference to theirs, he frequently puts them in their place. He begins as a sky and mountain god, provider of the indispensable rain. Like Yahweh, he is, among his earlier forms, a god of war. He debates with himself whether to end the siege of Troy or make the war more bloody, and decides for the latter course. Gradually he becomes the calm and mighty ruler of gods and men, bestriding Olympus in bearded dignity. He is the head and source of the moral order of the world. He punishes filial neglect, guards family property, sanctions oaths, pursues perjurers, and protects boundaries, hearths, suppliants, and guests. At last he is the serene dispenser of judgment, whom Phidias carves for Olympia. His one failing is the youthful readiness with which he falls in love. Not having created women, he admires them as wonderful things, bearing even to the gods the inestimable gifts of beauty and tenderness, and he finds it beyond him to resist them. Hesiod draws up a long list of the divine amours and their glorious offspring. His first mate is Dione, but he leaves her in Epirus when he moves to Thessalian Olympus. There his first wife is Metis, goddess of measure, mind, and wisdom. Gossip says that her children will dethrone him, therefore he swallows her, absorbs her qualities, and becomes himself the god of wisdom. Metis is delivered of Athena within him, and his head has to be cut open that Athena may be born. Lonely for loveliness, he takes Themis for his mate, and begets by her the 12 hours. Then he takes Eurynome, and begets the 3 graces. Then Mnemosyne, and engenders the 9 muses. Then Leto, and fathers Apollo and Artemis. Then his sister Demeter, and has Persephone. Finally, having sown his wild oats, he weds his sister Hera, makes her queen of Olympus, and receives from her Hebe, Ares, Hephaestus and Eileithyia. But he does not get along well with Hera. She is as old a god as he, and more honored in many states. She is the patron deity of matrimony and motherhood, protectress of the marriage tie. She is prim and grave and virtuous, and frowns upon his escapades. Moreover, she is an excellent shrew. He thinks of beating her, but finds it easier to console himself with new amours. His first mortal mate is Niobe. His last is Alcmena, who is descended from Niobe in the 16th generation. He loves also with Greek impartiality his handsome Ganymede, and snatches him up to be his cupbearer on Olympus. It was natural that so fertile a father should have some distinguished children. When Athena was born in full development and armament from the head of Zeus, she provided the literature of the world with one of its most hackneyed similes. She was an appropriate goddess for Athens, consoling its maids with her proud virginity, inspiring its men with martial ardor, and symbolizing for Pericles the wisdom that belonged to her as the daughter of Metis and Zeus. When Pallas the Titan tried to make love to her, she slew him and added his name to hers as a warning to other suitors. To her, Athens dedicated its loveliest temple and its most splendid festival. More widely worshipped than Athena was her comely brother Apollo, bright deity of the sun, patron of music, poetry, and art, founder of cities, maker of laws, god of healing, and father of Asclepius, far-darting archer and god of war, successor to Gaia and Phoebe at Delphi as the holiest oracle of Greece. As god of the growing crops, he received tithe offerings at harvest time, and in return he radiated his golden warmth and light from Delos and Delphi to enrich the soil. Everywhere he was associated with order, measure, and beauty, and whereas in other cults there were strange elements of fear and superstition, in the worship of Apollo and in his great festivals at Delphi and Delos, the dominant note was the rejoicing of a brilliant people in a god of health and wisdom, reason and song. Happy, too, was his sister Artemis, or Diana, maiden goddess of the chase, so absorbed in the ways of animals and the pleasure of the woods that she had no time for the love of men. She was the goddess of wild nature, of meadows, forests, hills, and the sacred bough. As Apollo was the ideal of Greek youth, so Artemis was the model of Greek girlhood, strong, athletic, graceful, chaste, and yet again she was the patroness of women in childbirth, who prayed to her to ease their pains. At Ephesus, she kept her Asiatic character as a goddess of motherhood and fertility. In this way, the ideas of virgin and mother became confused in her worship, and the Christian Church found it wise in the 5th century of our era to attach the remnants of this cult to Mary, and to transform the mid-August harvest festival of Artemis into the Feast of the Assumption. In such ways, the old is preserved in the new, and everything changes except the essence. History, like life, must be continuous or die. Character and institutions may be altered, but slowly. A serious interruption of their development throws them into national amnesia and insanity. A thoroughly human figure in this pantheon was the master craftsman of Olympus, that lame Hephaestus, whom the Romans knew as Vulcan. At first he seems a pitiful and ridiculous figure, this insulted and injured Quasimodo of the skies, but in the end our sympathies are with him rather than with the clever and unscrupulous gods who maltreat him. Perhaps in early days, before he became so human, he had been the leaping spirit of the fire and the forge. In the Homeric theogony, he is the son of Zeus and Hera, but other myths assure us that Hera, jealous of Zeus's unaided delivery of Athena, gave birth to Hephaestus without the aid of any male. Seeing him to be ugly and weak, she cast him down from Olympus. He found his way back and built for the gods the many mansions in which they dwelt. Though his mother had dealt so cruelly with him, he showed her all kindness and respect, and defended her so zealously in one of her quarrels with Zeus that the great Olympian seized him by the leg and hurled him down to the earth. A whole day Hephaestus fell. At last he landed on the island of Lemnos and hurt his ankle. Certainly thereafter, before that, says Homer, he was painfully lame. Again he found his way back to Olympus. In his resounding workshops he built a mighty anvil with 20 huge bellows, made the shield and armor of Achilles, statues that moved of their own accord, and other wonderful things. The Greeks worshipped him as the god of all metal trades, then of all handicrafts, and pictured the volcanoes as the chimneys of his subterranean forges. It was his misfortune that he married Aphrodite, for it is difficult for beauty to be virtuous. Learning of her affair with Ares, Hephaestus fashioned a trap that fell upon the lovers as they loved, and then the limping deity had his lame revenge by bringing his fellow gods to look in laughter upon the bound divinities of love and war. But to Hermes, Homer tells us, Apollo said, "Hermes, son of Zeus, wouldst thou in sooth be willing, even though ensnared with strong bonds, to lie on a couch by the side of golden Aphrodite?" Then the messenger answered him, "Would that this might befall, Lord Apollo, that thrice as many bonds inextricable might clasp me about, and that ye gods, I and all the goddesses too, might be looking on, but that I might sleep by the side of golden Aphrodite." Ares, Mars, was never distinguished for intelligence or subtlety. His business was war, and even the charms of Aphrodite could not give him the thrill that came to him from lusty and natural killing. Homer calls him the curse of men, and tells with pleasure how Athena laid him low with a stone. He covered as he lay 7 acres of the field. Hermes, or Mercury, is more interesting. In origin he is a stone, and from the cult of sacred stones his worship is derived. The stages of his evolution are still visible. Then he is the tall stone placed upon graves, or he is the daimon, or spirit, in this stone. Then he is the boundary stone, or its god, marking and guarding a field, and because his function there is also to promote fertility, the phallus becomes one of his symbols. Then he is the herm, or pillar, with carved head, uncarved body, and prominent male member, which was placed before all respectable houses in Athens. We shall see how the mutilation of these hermi on the eve of the expedition against Syracuse provided the proximate cause for the ruin of Alcibiades and Athens. Again, he is the god of wayfarers and the protector of heralds. Their characteristic staff, or caduceus, is one of his favorite insignia. As god of travelers, he becomes a god of luck, trade, cunning, and gain, therefore an inventor and guarantor of measures and scales, a patron saint of perjurers, embezzlers, and thieves. He is himself a herald, bearing the billets and decrees of Olympus from god to god or man, and he moves on winged sandals with the speed of an angry wind. His running about gives him a lithe and graceful form, and prepares him for Praxiteles. As a swift and vigorous youth, he is the patron saint of athletes, and his shamelessly virile image has a place in every palestra. As herald, he is the god of eloquence. As celestial interpreter, he is the first of a long hermeneutical line. One of the Homeric hymns tells how, in his youth, he stretched strings across a tortoise shell, and so invented the lyre. Finally, it comes his turn to appease Aphrodite, and their offspring, we are told, is a delicate hermaphrodite, sharing their charms and named from their names. It was characteristic of Greece that, in addition to deities of chastity, virginity, and motherhood, it should have a goddess of beauty and love. Doubtless, in her Near Eastern origins, and in Cyprus, her half-Oriental home, Aphrodite was first of all a mother goddess. To the end of her tenure, she remained associated with reproduction and fertility in the whole realm of plant, animal, and human life. But as civilization developed and increasing security obviated the need for a high birth rate, the aesthetic sense was left free to see other values in woman than those of multiplication, and to make Aphrodite not only the embodiment of the ideal of beauty, but the deity of all heterosexual pleasure. The Greeks worshipped her in many forms, as Aphrodite Urania, the heavenly, the goddess of chaste or sacred love, as Aphrodite Pandemos, the popular, the goddess of profane love in all its modes, and even as Aphrodite Kallippagos, the Venus of the lovely Nates. At Athens and Corinth, the courtesans built temples to her as their patron saint. At the beginning of April, various cities in Greece celebrated her great festival, the Aphrodisia, and on that occasion, for those who cared to take part, sexual freedom was the order of the day. She was the love goddess of the sensual and passionate south, ancient rival of Artemis, the love goddess of the cold and hunting north. Mythology, almost as ironic as history, made her the wife of the crippled Festus, but she consoled herself with Ares, Hermes, Poseidon, Dionysius, and many a mortal like Anchises and Adonis. To her, in competition with Hera and Athena, Paris awarded the golden apple as the prize of beauty. But perhaps she was never really beautiful until Praxiteles reconceived her, and gave her the loveliness for which Greece could forgive all her sins. To the legitimate or illegitimate children of Zeus we must add, as major Olympians, his sister Hestia, goddess of the hearth, and his unruly brother Poseidon. This Greek Neptune, secure in his watery realms, considered himself fully the equal of Zeus. Even landlocked nations worshipped him, for he commanded not only the sea but the rivers and the springs. It was he who guided the mysterious subterranean streams and made earthquakes with tidal waves. To him Greek mariners prayed, and raised appeasing temples on perilous promontories. Subordinate deities were numerous even on Olympus, for there was no end to personifications. There was Hestia, the Roman Vesta, goddess of the hearth and of its sacred fire. There was Iris, the rainbow, sometimes messenger for Zeus, Hebe, goddess of youth, Eileithyia, who helped women in childbirth, Dike, or justice, Tyche, or chance, and Eros, or love, whom Hesiod made the creator of the world, whom Sappho called a limb-dissolving, bittersweet, impracticable wild beast. There was Hymenaeus, the marriage song, Hypnos, or sleep, Oniros, or dream, Geras, old age, Lethe, oblivion, Thanatos, or death, and others beyond naming. There were 9 muses to inspire artists and poets, Clio for history, Euterpe for lyric poetry accompanied by the flute, Thalia for comic drama and idyllic poetry, Melpomene for tragedy, Terpsichore for choral dance and song, Erato for love verse and mimicry, Polymnia for hymns, Urania for astronomy, Calliope for epic poetry. There were 3 Graces and their 12 attendants, the Hours. There was Nemesis, who meted out good and evil to men, and visited with disaster all who were guilty of hubris, insolence in prosperity. There were the terrible Erinyes, the Furies who left no wrong unrevenged. The Greeks, with deprecating euphemism, called them well-wishers, Eumenides. And finally there were the Moirai, the Fates or Allotters, who regulated inevitably the affairs of life and ruled, some said, both gods and men. In that conception Greek religion found its limit and flowed over into science and law. We have left for the last the most troublesome, the most popular, the most difficult to classify of all the Greek gods. Only late in his career was Dionysius received into Olympus. In Thrace, which gave him as a Greek gift to Greece, he was the god of liquor brewed from barley, and was known as Sabazius. In Greece he became a god of wine, the nourisher and guardian of the vine. He began as a goddess of fertility, became a god of intoxication, and ended as a son of God, dying to save mankind. Many figures and legends were mingled to make his myth. The Greeks thought of him as Zagreus, the horned child born to Zeus by his daughter Persephone. He was the best beloved of his father and was seated beside him on the throne of heaven. When the jealous Hera incited the Titans to kill him, Zeus, to disguise him, changed him into a goat, then a bull. In this form, nevertheless, the Titans captured him, cut his body into pieces, and boiled them in a cauldron. Athena, like another Trelawney, saved the heart and carried it to Zeus. Zeus gave it to Semele, who, impregnated with it, gave the god a second birth under the name of Dionysus. Mourning for Dionysus's death and joyful celebration for his resurrection formed the basis of a ritual extremely widespread among the Greeks. In springtime, when the vine was bursting into blossom, Greek women went up into the hills to meet the reborn god. For 2 days they drank without restraint, and like our less religious Bacchanalians, considered him witless who would not lose his wits. They marched in wild procession, led by Maenads, or madwomen devoted to Dionysus. They listened tensely to the story they knew so well of the suffering, death, and resurrection of their god, and as they drank and danced they fell into a frenzy in which all bonds were loosed. The height and center of their ceremony was to seize upon a goat, a bull, sometimes a man, seeing in them incarnations of the god, to tear the live victim to pieces in commemoration of Dionysus's dismemberment, then to drink the blood and eat the flesh in a sacred communion, whereby, as they thought, the god would enter them and possess their souls. In that divine enthusiasm they were convinced that they and the god became one, in a mystic and triumphant union. They took his name, called themselves, after one of his titles, Bacchoi, and knew that now they would never die. Or they termed their state an ecstasis, a going out of their souls to meet and be one with Dionysus. Thus they felt free from the burden of the flesh, they acquired divine insight, they were able to prophesy, they were gods. Such was the passionate cult that came down from Thrace into Greece like a medieval epidemic of religion, dragging one region after another from the cold and clear Olympians of the state worship into a faith and ritual that satisfied the craving for excitement and release, the longing for enthusiasm and possession, mysticism and mystery. The priests of Delphi and the rulers of Athens tried to keep the cult at a distance, but failed. All they could do was to adopt Dionysus into Olympus, Hellenize and humanize him, give him an official festival, and turn the revelry of his worshippers from the mad ecstasy of wine among the hills into the stately processions, the robust songs, and the noble drama of the great Dionysia. For a while they won Dionysus over to Apollo, but in the end Apollo yielded to Dionysus's heir and conqueror, Christ. 3. Mysteries. There were essentially three elements and stages in Greek religion: Chthonian, Olympian, and mystic. The first was probably of Pelasgo-Mycenaean origin, the second probably Achaeodorian, the third Egypto-Asiatic. The first worshipped subterranean, the second celestial, the third resurrected gods. The first was most popular among the poor, the second among the well-to-do, the third in the lower middle class. The first predominated before the Homeric age, the second in it, the third after it. By the time of the Periclean Enlightenment, the most vigorous element in Greek religion was the mystery. In the Greek sense, a mystery was a secret ceremony in which sacred symbols were revealed, symbolic rites were performed, and only initiates were the worshippers. Usually the rites represented or commemorated in semi-dramatic form the suffering, death, and resurrection of a god, pointed back to old vegetation themes and magic, and promised the initiate a personal immortality. Many places in Greece celebrated such mystic rites, but no other place in this respect could rival Eleusis. The mysteries there were of pre-Achaean origin, and appear to have been originally an autumn festival of plowing and sowing. A myth explained how Demeter, rewarding the people of Attica for their kindness to her in her wanderings, established at Eleusis her greatest temple, which was destroyed and rebuilt many times during the history of Greece. Under Solon, Pisistratus, and Pericles, the festival of Demeter at Eleusis was adopted by Athens and raised to higher elaboration and pomp. In the lesser mysteries, held near Athens in the spring, candidates for initiation underwent a preliminary purification by self-immersion in the waters of the Ilissus. In September, the candidates and others walked in grave but happy pilgrimage for 14 miles along the sacred way to Eleusis, bearing at their head the image of the Chthonian deity Iacchus. The procession arrived at Eleusis under torchlight and solemnly placed the image in the temple, after which the day was ended with sacred dances and songs. The greater mysteries lasted 4 days more. Those who had been purified with bathing and fasting were now admitted to the lesser rites. Those who had received such rites a year before were taken into the hall of initiation, where the secret ceremony was performed. The mystai, or initiates, broke their fast by participating in a holy communion in memory of Demeter, drinking a holy mixture of meal and water, and eating sacred cakes. What mystic ritual was then performed we do not know. The secret was well kept throughout antiquity under penalty of death. Even the pious Aeschylus narrowly escaped condemnation for certain lines that might have given the secret away. The ceremony was in any case a symbolic play and had a part in generating the Dionysian drama. Very probably, the theme was the rape of Persephone by Pluto, the sorrowful wandering of Demeter, the return of the maiden to earth, and the revelation of agriculture to Attica. The summary of the ceremony was the mystic marriage of a priest representing Zeus with a priestess impersonating Demeter. These symbolic nuptials bore fruit with magic speed, for it was soon followed, we are told, by a solemn announcement that Our Lady has borne a holy boy, and a reaped ear of corn was exhibited as symbolizing the fruit of Demeter's labor, the bounty of the fields. The worshippers were then led by dim torchlight into dark subterranean caverns, symbolizing Hades, and again to an upper chamber brilliant with light, representing, it appears, the abode of the blessed. And they were now shown in solemn exaltation the holy objects, relics, or icons that till that moment had been concealed. In this ecstasy of revelation, we are assured, they felt the unity of God and the oneness of God in the soul. They were lifted up out of the delusion of individuality and knew the peace of absorption into deity. In the age of Pisistratus, the mysteries of Dionysius entered into the Eleusinian liturgy by a religious infection. The god Iacchus was identified with Dionysus as the son of Persephone, and the legend of Dionysus Zagreus was superimposed upon the myth of Demeter. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.